All right, it's now 7 o'clock, so we'll start. Yeah, thank you to anyone who's tuned in. Today, if anyone's watching, perfect. Okay, so today I'd like to speak about Ta'amei HaMitzvot, so which means the reason behind mitzvot. Coming to yeshiva, one of the main goals I really set out for myself was to try and understand the reason behind as many mitzvot as possible, and try to find added value in that mitzvah which I'd just previously performed because that's what I'd grown up doing. And I think whilst trying to achieve this, I came across the topic which really fascinated me, and is going to be the topic of this shiur today. So, growing up, I used to really struggle with the idea of chukim, mitzvot which seemed to not have a logical reason, and mitzvot that we just follow, such as the laws of shatnez. The fact that this cannot be rationalized by any form of reasoning made very little sense to me, because if mitzvot are meant to give us a guide how to live our life, how would it be possible that these things don't have a logical basis? How could Hashem command us to do these things? Anyway, and then the second thing I really wanted to discuss was even when we are given a reason behind the mitzvah, I still think this problem isn't really resolved. If we look at Shabbat, for example, on Shabbat Kiddush, we say Ki Sheisha Yamim Asa Hashem et Hashemayim v'et haaretz v'yom hashavi Shabbat v'yinafash. For me, it always caused me a slight difficulty, because for me, this poses the question: what would happen if the prohibition of malacha on Shabbat doesn't cause a freezing feeling of relaxation? So if I feel like in order to get to the goal of me feeling relaxed, it'd be better for me to drive to shul, surely would that not be a better way to carry out the mitzvah? And it's clearly a prohibition in the Torah. So how do we sort of resolve that conflict? And I think this really illustrates the danger of providing a reason behind a mitzvah, because as soon as someone believes that they're above that reason and it doesn't really apply to them, they might think that they are not obligated to do the mitzvah. And I think you see this, for example, with a kippah. So people say that the reasoning behind you wear a kippah is to remind you of God's existence. So there's always that one person who will come along and take a kippah off their head and say, I'm remembering God, I know what I'm doing. And then they end up taking the kippah off their head and they're not doing what they've been instructed to do. So yeah, you can see how it could be very, very dangerous for this sort of ideology to continue. And I think that this is demonstrated probably best in the Tanakh by Shlomo HaMelech, because in Devarim Zayin Gimel, it says, as you can see, you should not intermarry them, do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. So here Hashem's clearly given us a commandment, and straight afterwards he's given us the reason, because if your children will intermarry, then they will undoubtedly turn towards other gods. And Shlomo decides that this is not for him. In Shoftim, we later see that he takes 700 wives from all different children of the 7 nations, and he believes that his heart won't led astray. The Midrash suggests that he believes that he was exempt from this commandment because he thought the reasons didn't apply to him. And in the end, Shlomo unfortunately fell into the trap and turned towards idolatry. He wasn't strong enough to overcome this, and as a result, God promised to split the Jewish nation into 2 separate kingdoms, a consequence which is largely held true to this day. And I think this story really demonstrates that everyone is required to follow the same commandments, regardless of whether they believe that the rationale behind it applies to them. Because even Shlomo HaMelech, who built the first temple for us, he thought that his judgment was better than God's and that he could get away with it, and clearly it was shown that he was wrong. Okay, so now let's look at what the Rambam has to say on the matter. Having dedicated a lot of time to the composition of Sefer HaMitzvot, which outlines every mitzvah that Rambam believes we were commanded to perform, you would have assumed that he finds very great importance in Ta'amei HaMitzvot. However, in Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed, Rambam states quite clearly, those who trouble themselves to find a cause for any of the detailed rules are, in my eyes, void of sense. They do not remove any difficulties, but rather increase them. And I think what this means to say is that whilst in large the purpose for the mitzvah may be logical and for your own benefit, the finer details might perhaps be less rational and might be beyond our realm of understanding. And I think that Rambam accepts that it shouldn't cause him a trouble because it's just not something that he can fully comprehend. And I understand his logic behind that. And then similarly to this, there's also a practical approach, which I heard in Rav Tabori's shiur. He highlighted the fact that there's not much difference between working the Beit HaMikdash and Avodah Zarah. Both stem from the same desire to show love for Hashem and to serve him. Rambam suggests that the original plan did not include Korbanot or the Beit HaMikdash, but after Cher HaEgel, it was imposed to provide a structure for us to serve Hashem, as opposed to just do whatever we wanted. And I think carrying this idea forward, there's a clear line of argument which would suggest that halacha couldn't be a subjective process. In order for there to be a structure within religion, there must be clear boundaries set, and there must be a way to do every little detail of every mitzvah. And while sometimes it might not be the case that the little details are important, we must adhere to them for our own sake and for the sake of structure rather than for the sake of reasoning. And I think under this logic, it's quite different to other opinions, because there's no real need for finding mitzvot if the only thing that it really adds is a bit more comfort. The rules must be followed regardless, and it's really unimportant whether or not you can understand or connect to the reason behind it. But there's obviously the other side to the argument. Jews have spent thousands of years widely accepting that mitzvot have reasons which are important and really affect the way that you perform them. There's books out there such as Sefer HaChinuch, which builds off Rambam's list of 630 mitzvot and takes every mitzvah and seeks to explain exactly why we do it. And I think for a lot of your average Jew, it would be a lot more easier to connect and understand with this sort of logic, because you can take the action, know why you're doing it, give it meaning, and find a deeper connection to the mitzvah and perform it with more kavanah. And a great example of this, I think, is really tefillah, because when you say the Shemona Esrei 3 times a day, it can become a lot harder to remember the reason behind davening. It sometimes can feel maybe a bit like a chore for some people. And if you really sit and take time to learn and understand the importance of maintaining a relationship with God throughout your day, I think it can become a much more empowering and meaningful experience. And yes, moving on from this, we will look at what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has to say in the Kuzari. He says, one who fully accepts the mitzvah without intellectually contemplating is on a greater level than one who contemplates the reason behind mitzvah. Nonetheless, for one who no longer is at this lofty level and has been drawn after logic, it is better to find wisdom in these mitzvot than to think poorly of the commandments and cause spiritual self-destruction. And I really want to focus here on the spiritual self-destruction aspect of this argument, because I think in the modern world, where intellect is really a center of society, it's very difficult to have complete blind faith in God's commandments without trying to find every logical explanation. I think we're very accustomed to having a reasoning behind everything we do. So to completely let go of that sort of perspective can be really difficult. And if we follow the path of ignoring the reason behind mitzvot, the Kuzari brings the critical point that we may view our own judgment above God's and belittle the commandments which were given to us. Put simply, I think that the Kuzari is trying to argue that it's better to find a reason which works for you than to say that the mitzvah has none at all and lose faith. Perfect. The next source is the Nativ. So you guys can obviously read what the Nativ has to say regarding mitzvot. He says that while performing a mitzvah, one should not think of the reason behind them, but rather think that it is what God commands him. And I think what the Nativ does really well is he conflates both ideas into one, proposing that whilst there are definite reasons behind mitzvot, sometimes we should maybe do things purely for the sake of the mitzvah as opposed to being for our own personal benefit. I think a lot of times when it comes to like kashrut, which we can't really understand, people tend to like lean on the argument that perhaps it might be a healthier lifestyle, it might be better to not be able to eat fast food, etc. But I think that really makes the mitzvah about you as opposed to making the mitzvah about just being what you were commanded to do. And I think that that's really important. And finally, I want to look at what the Me'iri has to say. And the Me'iri says that one who has the opportunity to learn Torah and perform a mitzvah should prioritize the mitzvah if it cannot be later performed. However, if the mitzvah can be performed later, if one needs to learn Torah, one must prioritize learning, as learning Torah enhances the halachic performance, and mitzvot are more beautiful when performed by one who understands them. So, having gone through the ideas, I think the one aspect which perhaps hasn't been touched upon so greatly, and I really wanted to emphasize, is that perhaps when someone truly understands a mitzvah, it can be much more valuable and powerful, because it's very easy to live a religious life going through the motions and being really without God. Because when there's a rule book to follow, it sometimes can seem as if it's not connected to anything greater. But I think when you can prescribe meaning to each and every individual action that you take and understand how it relates to Hashem, you'll feel much more closer to God, and also it will be a much more elevated experience and not really feel like a burden. And so that's the end of the source sheets. And just to conclude, I wanted to look back in the Torah to see if we can find maybe a way to resolve this. And what I came across was when the famous response of the Jews accepting the Torah from God. And they famously said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do it and we will listen. And whilst understanding mitzvot, the nishma part of listening and taking in all the details, maybe an important aspect in enhancing our actions, I think the ultimate focus of the Jews has always been to do Na'aseh and take action and follow the commandments, whether we fully understand the reasoning or we fully don't understand the reasoning. I think that is the message that I wanted to leave everyone with. And yeah, so that is all I have to say about Ta'amei HaMitzvot.